treating individual human social disturbance medically has failed by all accounts. Despite over the $100 billion a year spent on mental health services, despite the scores of putative, effective, evidence-based practices identified by experts, despite the millions of psychiatric drug prescriptions dispensed each year to ameliorate these medical diseases, 1 in 5 Americans, as has been known before, adults are now diagnosable as crazy. I, as others have asserted, there's something wrong with that picture. I think that it's what we call the medical disease slash, model of madness, and it's exemplified and has been for well over 30 years, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which categorized these mental disorders, which Alan mentions, they didn't mean to suggest are diseases, but it's hard to figure out what else they might have meant. Critics of the DSM by now include both the longtime critics, some of us, Tom Sass, and then we have the mainstream supporters and former fellow travelers, Andreas and Alan, Greenberg, Insel, Tom Insel, all have kind of criticized the DSM. So we're all, I guess, in a group hug about that. No serious scholars any longer claim that these are real-world diseases like cancer, diabetes, or heart disease. Now, I just want to mention that, of course, these so-called real physical diseases may themselves be under some evolving definitions, but nevertheless are associated with various biological markers or signs, as mental disorders have never been. The foundational assumptions of the mental health biomedical industrial complex has been that mental disorders are brain disorders. I do want to mention that, of course, this idea of associating the brain with madness goes back to the Greeks, when we had no science. Medical science is, I don't know, 150, 160 years old. So the idea of associating brain with craziness has a very long history. So it's a natural take to associate brain issues with bad behavior. The tactics, in my judgment, of psychiatry, and I mean all the way back to the mid-1800s, rather than the last 30 years, as often is discussed, has been deny, deny, deny. Even though the mainstream empirical research has consistently failed to corroborate the brain disorder hypotheses, the psychiatric establishment just as consistently clings to its theological belief and uncritically redoubles its effort to find the physiological, biological, or neurocellular, that's the latest version, indicators of these putative diseases / disorders. Contrastingly, in the hardest of sciences, physics, historically, when observed world did not fit into the latest natural laws, for example, Newton's theory of action at a distance in the Descartesian mechanical philosophy, or phenomena unexplained by Newtonian mechanics, but better explained by Einstein's two theories of relativity, or the necessity of inventing quantum mechanics to explain the action of physical phenomena at nanoscopic levels, because classical mechanics could not. What changed was the supposed universal law into another one better fitting the evidence. The falsifying evidence rules in rigorous hard science and promotes theoretical revision, not the adherence to all dogma. And so this is a very fundamental difference between psychiatric researchers who, while freely admitting that they have failed, instead of seeking as good science demands, the data falsifying the hypotheses, then rewriting the current theories and testing them to see if the new theoretical approaches might be more valid than the prior ones. Psychiatric science, which is scientism in my judgment, pursues their commitments, their theological commitments, to a perspective like the answer is in brain disease explanations, regardless of the consistent falsifying. I'm going to offer a model that I've come to just style, solving problems in everyday living, spiel. You can look up the meaning of spiel. A model of education for self-understanding and action. So let me talk a little bit about the background of why I thought that this might be of some value. The notion of education, self or other, as a way to address emotional, behavioral, interpersonal, social difficulties has been around for a very long time. What I'm about to say is not original. Perhaps the first publicly articulated advertisement for self-awareness and personal responsibility for it might be the inscription on the forecourt of the Temple of Apollo in 9th century BCE Delphi, which was the home of the Delphic oracle. The inscription is, "Know thyself." More famously and familiarly, a couple of hundred years later, Socrates, by way of Plato in the Apology, declared, "An unexamined life is not worth living for a human being." Let me go to the most important reference that exists today, Wikipedia, which is our most influential and probably democratic source of knowledge. This is what they say about therapy. Therapeutic interaction or treatment contracted between a trained professional and a client. During psychotherapy, one hopes to learn about their condition and moods, feelings, thoughts, and behaviors, how to take control of one's life and respond to challenging situations. Frank and Frank, the previously mentioned family group, in their book, one of the most comprehensive and famous overviews about psychotherapy in its variety of forms, says this, and I quote, "In all forms of psychotherapy, the therapist is a teacher who provides new information in an interpersonal context that enables the patient to profit from it." My point is that whatever happens in psychotherapy, and no one knows, it's magic. What I assert happens is an educational engagement where people learn. They're not given some special, mysterious force that goes from one powerful individual, perhaps a witch doctor. We have all these wonderful words, which ultimately, in my judgment, are magical. So it's very enticing and very seductive. Magic is intriguing for all of us. But based on the credible presumption from the empirical evidence that learning is an essential, if not the primary process necessary for self-reflection, learning, problem solving, let me outline what the model might look like. This is sort of the obvious in terms of what happens currently, what the ways that we treat these deeply troubling human experiences. We use drugs, and this has been discussed earlier. They're all highly toxic, And they turn out to be about as good as placebo, more or less, across the board. Then we have this thing called therapy, which I argue, despite denials by many therapists, by the use of that term therapy, the process is medically framed. We talk of symptomatic behavior. We talk of something called psychotherapy. Tom wrote a book called The Myth of Psychotherapy, in case you're interested. No one knows what the hell psychotherapy is. It's therapeuticizing a non-existent abstraction. It makes no sense if you take it seriously in and of itself. And I argue by all research appearances, those effects that are observed are due to persuasive talk, charisma, and placebo. And they're all framed, and this is very important, under the threat of coercion. We don't even think of it that way, but our involuntary treatment laws, all of those things are known by everyone. And so the behavior is always based on that framework. So if I screw with you too much, and I think you're just not cooperating, I always have the authority to lock you up. I always have the authority. And it's not just the shrinks. I don't want to blame it all on Alan, but, you know, we, psychiatric social workers, clinical psychologists, we're all involved in this. So I think that that's right, and we have to own it, not put it off on some other profession. We're all in the game together. We all benefit. Cui bono is a great question to ask. So here are the elements that I'm suggesting are required for what I consider this educational enterprise. You need a person seeking self-understanding. I call it an education. Voluntarily, about explicit or felt problems in living, needing explanation and solutions. Then you need a professional, and I mean by that anyone collecting a fee for the service regardless of certification, since no credential guarantees skill. As you know, much of that is about turfing, right? That's why we get credentials, so we have special authority. Who is experienced in the travails of life, human behavior, and primarily in rhetoric. The job is to explore and identify problematic, habituated behavior, verbal or nonverbal, patterns and strategies used by the learner for an existential survival and some possible alternatives for consideration. That is the exploration that has to take place, however you style it, in my judgment. You have to help the person, first of all, become self-aware, if they're not already, about some regular responses, strategies to cope with their perhaps extremely problematic life. And that's what we call, you know, syndromes and schizophrenia and all these words. These are strategies of survival, in my judgment. Professional is the agent of the learner, committed to aid the full emancipation of that person. The only thing that I really feel close to Freud about is that his fundamental commitment was to emancipate. He screwed up. For a safe and confidential environment created by the skillful educator, which is conducive to the revelation of the lack of skill, ignorance, confusion, fear, ambivalence, or uncertainty of the learner. The work, 5, and its outcome are determined through mutual feedback and correction. The ultimate arbiter of the success or failure of the effort is the person seeking help, no one else. Because the life for which the help is sought is the help seekers, as are the consequences of the educational work. The person has to take responsibility, because whatever comes out of that dialogue, that person will suffer, no one else. Thank you. So, what is the possibility of actually getting this funded? We already know that we spend $100 billion a year for mental health funding, so we have lots of money. So as done for students in higher education, make available government-funded or guaranteed educational loans similar to the current funding streams to be repaid under the same terms and conditions as other students. For the poor, which is the largest group, Alan styles them as severely and persistently mentally ill. I just style them as the public dependents who are considered functionally disordered. That's why the label SMI. That's a functional diagnostic group, because they all similarly seem to have, according to the judgment of the rest of us, failed in life. Poor educational skills, interpersonal skills, you know, they're very, very different in terms of what they expect in life than we are. So that's a functional label, the SMI, in my judgment. Those folks, we would funnel the government dollars currently being paid to the public and private mental health organizations providing treatments, instead through the qualified clients, using economic status, not mental health diagnosis. And that could pay in part for, you know, the Spiel services or any other service. And I think even Alan Francis suggests that we need many, many ways of responding. Self-directed care, which is a current sort of medicalized psychiatric version where the clients in part receive a certain amount of money that they can spend any way they like. So loosely following Charles Murray's suggestion in his 2006 book called In Our Hands, provide an annual grant, guaranteed annual income for all citizens of an amount somewhere between $10,000 to $20,000 a year, beginning in early adulthood, and it continues till the person dies. This annual payment would be in lieu of all other welfare services or payments, excepting Social Security and Medicaid. Murray wants those also to be eliminated. I just disagree. That funding could be used for any needs that all the citizens have, and one of the possible services could be this particular educational model that I'm promoting. And that, I think, really sums this up, but I do want to say that there's one assumption that I made here, and I think it's an important one. In order to proceed with this kind of approach, as David Stewart Kirk and I have argued in our book, Math Science, we have to be very careful to separate out those who are voluntarily engaged in trying to understand their problems in living from those who are socially controlled because of their apparent bad behavior and wind up in this coercive, often criminal justice environment. Those are two very different roles. Psychiatry or mental health must separate those two out and have different approaches to those two groups. Even if you don't quite agree, we can all agree that what we do in what you call psychotherapy and what I call education is learning. That's the fundamental process. That's my argument. I appreciate your attention. Thank you.